Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today we're going to be doing the series The Port Authority, where I take a look at some of my favorite arcade games of all time and weigh them directly against their home console ports. And if you can't tell already, today we are playing Fatal Fury Wild Ambition. And while not many people ever got a chance to play the arcade original because it is on the Hyper Neo Geo 64, a very rare piece of hardware that did not succeed, a lot of people played it on PlayStation 1, so we're going to be comparing the two ports today. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But I'm going to spoil this right off the top. The Hyper Neo Geo 64 version of Fatal Fury Wild Ambition is an absolutely outstanding game that's got a great frame rate, really responsive controls, awesome graphics, both 3D and 2D, and it's just a metric crap ton of fun. When we get over to the PlayStation 1 version of the game, it's going to be a completely different story. This is probably one of the worst ports from any arcade game I've seen so far doing this series. But if you've never played the Hyper Neo Geo original, do be aware that it does emulate really well in MAME. Unfortunately, you're not going to get any sound, and if you try to actually find an arcade cabinet for this today, you're going to basically be disappointed because these things are almost extinct in North America, and even in Japan, you're not really going to see many of them at all. This is kind of the domain of just collecting arcade cabinets or arcade boards at this point in time. But if you heard Fatal Fury Wild Ambition isn't a good game, it's probably because you've heard details of the PlayStation 1 version, which we're switching over to now. The frame rate on this is abysmal, the response time is terrible, the 2D backgrounds took a drop in resolution, and you don't have any of the animations in the backgrounds whatsoever. This basically feels like a lifeless dead world that you're having a fight in. Even the infinite plane has some issues actually looking like it is the ground. But the number one disappointment on this port is the fact that the fighters control like they're actually swimming underwater. Think about the moon jump physics in something like Virtual Fighter and translate that over into a Fatal Fury game. And while Wild Ambition on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 wasn't as fast as the 2D entries, honestly here on PlayStation 1 it just feels like an absolute mess. You're going to pull off moves and have no idea how you actually did it. And you'll see there, even when you end a match, the staggering in the frame rate is just no good. And that's just a huge sin to commit when it comes to porting a fighting game to a home console, because the responsiveness of a fighting game is where it lives or dies. As we move back over to the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version, you can instantaneously see the fluidity come back in all of the character animations and just the moveset input. And again, take a look at the background. It is some really nice 2D, and you do have all those animations in the background, the people just living their lives, shopping for clothing, everything like that. That's what you want to see when you play a fighting game. Even though the action in front of you is the primary focal point, you do want those lush backgrounds, and SNK was known for making some incredible ones back in the day. And I get it, the Hyper Neo Geo 64 could not compete with something like the Model 2 or 3 from Sega. It's not the best 3D in arcades, but it still has a really nice appearance to it, and it had so much RAM and storage capacity for those 2D background assets. You just had a more living, breathing world that you actually felt like you were inhabiting, versus the PlayStation 1 version, which basically feels like you're just having a fight up against a photo backdrop. Now that we've won the match over here, let's move over to the PlayStation 1 version and just take a look at the background again, and the characters and everything else. It's just stilted and motionless. Definitely the characters, Mai and Kim here, have taken a reduction in their polygons as well, but the big thing is it's taken a hit in the frame rate department, but it doesn't really seem to be programmed to actually accommodate for that, because your inputs are just sloppy here. Trying to pull off moves on the arcade board, super easy to do, but here on the PlayStation 1 version, I always really struggle with it, and it kind of feels like the game is in some ways playing itself, and that is just a letdown. And just so you know, this is coming off real hardware, as is the Hyper Neo Geo 64 footage, so you really are getting as close as to a one-to-one approximation of what these would look like as possible. But let's go side by side here. You'll see how the match starts, and even that intro is completely different, and that is just a disappointment. And here on my stage, a lot of it when you start has been just completely removed. That gigantic waterfall in the background, that water crashing over the rocks, just isn't here in the PlayStation 1 version. No matter which way I turn the camera and angle, I cannot find it whatsoever. And this is one of the stages where it actually not having animations in the background doesn't hurt it as much because there aren't people back there, but even still it is a big letdown compared to what you get on the arcade. But the other big thing that took a hit here is the sound, so I'm going to give you a sound sample. First we're going to do the Hyper Neo Geo 64 hardware, then we'll move into PlayStation 1 and listen to the massive difference because it's huge.
Fight! Harry versus Yamazaki. Final round, fight.
Now, the soundtrack elements definitely have a different vibe sound-wise, but I don't think either one would be considered bad. I would say the Hyper Neo Geo 64 is definitely more appealing to my ear, but the actual announcer, those sound clips, and their compression on PlayStation 1 sound like absolute garbage. They are muffled and feel like they're so heavily compressed that they're basically like 1/8 of the actual bitrate of what you would have had on the original, and that is such a strange thing to do because obviously the CD format had more space than a Hyper Neo Geo 64 cartridge, so I don't know how you could possibly get that bad of audio out of something like the PlayStation 1. So as far as the audio quality is concerned, for a lot of instances, the PlayStation 1 version is just absolutely abysmal again. As we move over to the next stage here, again on PlayStation 1 hardware, this is another one where there was full animations in the Hyper Neo Geo 64 original that are just lost here, but again, watch how the fighters move. You're going to basically see this staccato motion in between some of the animations. It's like when they pulled the frames down to 30 frames per second, they didn't really do it in any sort of intelligent manner, so you do get this really weird cadence to the motion. And I'm really not sure why SNK didn't try to get this to run at 60 frames per second, but I'm sure that's down to the fact that the code based on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 would have to be ported over to PlayStation 1, which leads me into wondering, outside of the install base and the expense of producing cartridges, why this game wasn't ported to Nintendo 64, because both the N64 and the Hyper Neo Geo 64 share a CPU in common. Sure, on the visual side of the hardware, all of the things that are doing 2D and 3D, they completely differ, but the actual code is the same across both platforms. And now as we move over to the Hyper Neo Geo 64 footage again, you see you have better colors, you have that animation in that sunset golden hour. The water is rippling. Sure, it's not the most animated stage of the game, but you completely lose all of that when you come over to PlayStation 1. But the big takeaway here again is Fatal Fury Wild Ambition is a smooth, fun game to play on the Hyper Neo Geo 64. On the PlayStation 1, it is just not anything I would recommend anyone play, which is unfortunate because that's how this game gets such a bad reputation as being a game not worth playing, because most people have checked it out on PlayStation 1 and thought to themselves, this is not anywhere near as good as any other 3D fighting game on the platform. Where if you played it on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 before, maybe it's your favorite, maybe it's not for you, but you can say it is a competent game. And you will see here, if we take a look at the introductory sequence here, on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 side of things, you're going to get this full in-engine 3D animation that looks really nice. But once we move over to the PlayStation 1 footage in a moment, you're going to see it's all FMV video, which is not a bad thing, but it's interesting that SNK took so much time to make new FMV sequences and didn't seem to take all that much time to get the game running well on PlayStation 1. And that's exactly what Port Authority is all about, trying to compare two games across two different platforms and seeing which one is the preferred way to play. And I do love the overall 3D look of the Hyper Neo Geo 64. It's definitely a little bit crunchy, it's definitely a little bit janky, but that is what does it for me. And again, I do love a good FMV sequence, but as we move over to the PlayStation 1 footage right now, you tell me, was this the best use of SNK's time? Because I can't imagine this is where they should have put their energy and resources. Not only is the new intro sequence not really telling you much on the story front, but it really does seem like wasted effort compared to actually getting the game to run with any sort of decent performance, graphically or frame rate wise, on PS1. And this definitely has that Tekken animated intro sort of vibe that you saw back in the day. And it really does feel like SNK was trying to also do a, well, we did it too situation here. And that is just such a bummer. This game could have been a great port, it could have been a competent version of the game, and it could have made people realize that the Hyper Neo Geo 64 fighting games were worth playing, and unfortunately this is the only game ever to get ported from Hyper Neo Geo 64 to PlayStation 1. Some people think one of the Samurai Shodown 64 games was ported, but they just used the same title but changed the gameplay up. And you'll see here again on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version on Toji's stage here, look at all those waves crashing up onto the rocks and that completely ruined ship hull. Just get an idea of all of the animations and all the life in this stage while you also watch the animations of the fighters, because when we move over to the PlayStation 1 version again, that is going to be completely gone. The background feels like it is just one static image, kind of feels like you're on a stage and you have this little matte painting in the background that's trying to articulate some sort of sense of place. That is the disappointment about this game. Sure, the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version is not the best fighting game ever made. I would say it's a B+ effort, but when you bring it over to the PlayStation 1, a B+ effort becomes a D- game. And one, this title is basically panned by everyone who's ever played it. I'm sure it's because the PlayStation 1 version was fresh in everybody's mind. If you want to play Fatal Fury Wild Ambition, you should just emulate it in MAME. Granted, I am playing here on real hardware because it is in my collection, but you're going to have a better experience playing this game with no audio because MAME has none, with a decent frame rate and all of these backgrounds, than you ever are going to have it on PlayStation 1. And this is probably the first episode of Port Authority where I basically just say that the port is absolute garbage. It is 10 out of 10 terrible. It's embarrassing and just a disappointment that a game as good as this that not many people got a chance to play in its original incarnation ended up being so bad when it came across to home consoles. And that was the thing, everyone wanted to have a 3D fighter on PlayStation 1 back in the day that was successful, including SNK, but they really spent the least amount of time possible trying to actually get this thing to function. Because even though Geese here is absolutely kicking my ass, I am having so much fun playing this game, and I do have the PlayStation 1 version in my collection for the complete Hyper Neo Geo 64 factor of it, but it is just there for curiosity. I would never take it off the shelf and play it. So as far as the verdict here on Port Authority is concerned, the port on PlayStation 1 of Fatal Fury Wild Ambition is a 0 out of 10, would not recommend. But I'll have more episodes coming up soon. If you want to recommend any options for Port Authority, any games you want to see me compare, leave a comment down below. But short of that, we're done. I'm going to go play some Hyper Neo Geo. See you next time. Bye-bye.